everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the August edition of our series of writing workshops that we do throughout the year. Now you may have seen, I see a lot of new faces, so you may have seen that this event is sponsored by Nano RDU chapter of NaNoWriMo. So a lot of you might be wondering what NaNoWriMo is. That stands for National Novel Writing Month, which takes place in November. A large group of writers throughout the Triangle get together every year with the goal of each of us individually writing 50,000 words towards a novel. And as part of how we support our local community, the MLs, that stands for Municipal Liaison, or Heather and I and Sadie and a very exciting new person we'll be announcing soon, act as kind of the joint between the Nano headquarters and the Raleigh-Durham area. So we lead events, and in order to support our local writers, we have workshops throughout the year talking about craft or just getting together to blow off steam about, oh my God, this writing thing is really, really hard. One of the wonderful things that we've been able to do every year for the past several years is to partner with Durham County Libraries to have the Piedmont Laureate come and speak. And this is always one of the events that we feel most honored by because we ourselves, while we are absolutely passionate about writing, are not as experienced as these wonderful, wonderful people, and so we really praise. So we just wanted to start by thanking you so much for being here with us today. We're really, really excited to hear from you. So the Piedmont Laureate this year is the fantastic David Menconi. I really hope I pronounced that right.
Yes.
Thank you. And David was a staff writer for the Raleigh News Observer for 28 years. He's also written for Rolling Stone, Spin, Billboard, the New York Times. He has an upcoming book, Tobacco Rogue, which will be published in 2020, and it is a history of music in North Carolina. He's also brought along Louis Shiner, who's an acclaimed and award-winning novelist. A lot of his novels are centered around rock and roll, including the 1993 World Fantasy Award winner Glimpses. And he has a new novel called Outside the Gates of Eden. David and Louis, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're so honored to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for coming. And just a quick programming note, the Piedmont Laureate program, I do programs like this all around the Triangle through the year. There will be another Durham program in a couple of weeks, September 12th at Durham North Regional Library. This will be with my former NNO co-worker David Rayner about how to do research. So if you're wanting to write yourself, it will always help your writing to have your facts in order, and sometimes they're hard to find, and he will enlighten us as to how to find them. But today, Outside the Gates of Eden, very fine novel by Louis Shiner, 880 pages, quite ambitious. When you sat down to write this, did you really have in mind this is going to be a big epic?
Yeah. I had the circumstances where I just finished reading Anna Karenina, and I thought, wow, I'd like to write a big book. I'd like to write a really ambitious book. What would Tolstoy write if Tolstoy was going to write right now? Well, what's the big story that I want to write? And almost immediately I thought, well, it's what happened to that village in the 60s. And yeah, I knew it was going to be big. In fact, my intention was, since this was about 10 years ago when I started it, was to do what Ralph Ellison did and just fill a bunch of file drawers with manuscript and leave a mess behind for somebody to clean up and it's gone. And I figured I could spend the rest of my life working on this thing, and then I accidentally finished it.
I hate when that happens.
Yeah, it's terrible.
So it clocks in at about 880 pages or thereabouts, and immaculately, amazingly researched. There's the author's acknowledgement of this book is kind of incredible. I mean, it goes through sources for everything quite generously. I don't know.
Including David Menconi.
Yeah, including my master's thesis from the University of Texas. So,
which is really good, by the way.
Oh, shucks. But I don't know that I've ever seen acknowledgments quite to that detail. You definitely showed your work here.
Well, I think it's important to let people know when you're not making stuff up. And also, there's a fine line in the book because it is a novel, and yet it features all these real-life people. And I mean, most people are probably going to recognize that John Sebastian and Joan Baez are real characters. But a lot of these people, they're not going to know their names. The guy who's the manager of the Kingston Trio shows up in the book and talks for a while. And it's just really important to me to let people know that this is a historical person and I'm not making this stuff up. And the stuff that I did make up, I wanted to be clear about it. For example, we were just talking about Woodstock. There was a guy named Hugh Romney, later known as Wavy Gravy, who just one of my heroes. Great man who kept Woodstock peaceful, basically, by setting the vibe for it. Really super interesting guy. And he started out as a comedian. He was doing stand-up in Greenwich Village.
Nobody for president.
Yeah. And I had him featured as a character in the book in which he's on stage and talking and was making up dialogue for him and stuff like that. And it's important I think, to acknowledge, okay, I made this up, but I based it on his books and his videos.
So your take on the 60s in this book is not exactly optimistic. I mean, it's fairly jaundiced, quite frankly.
Well, there was a sense as I was doing my research, and a lot of this I didn't know where it was going when I started. And I trusted myself enough to just dive into the research and start writing. But one of the things that I kept finding out is there were all these milestones, like, for instance, the Summer of Love, which is everybody has been left with the impression that the Summer of Love was kind of the high point of hippiedom and all that. And yet, as you start reading about it and talking to reading about people who were actually there and talking to them and reading their memoirs and stuff, they're all saying, oh man, you should have been here when it was good. And that's just kind of a repeated theme throughout the book. Everybody says, oh yeah, well, it kind of sucks now, but it was great a year ago or, 2 or 3 years ago.
Before you got here.
Before you got here. And so all the, there was just this sense that we somehow just missed it. And so that became a kind of an important theme of the book.
And Woodstock is one of the real life signpost events in it, but as seen through the eyes of the main character, it's kind of anticlimactic. And honestly, it's sort of the end of a big part of his life.
Yeah, and I think that Woodstock was the end of that era. Really, kind of. You can point to Altamont, which was a pop festival later that year, at the end of the year, where there was a murder committed by Hell's Angels, and everything was just kind of riotous and out of control. And some people place Altamont as kind of the official signpost at the end of the 60s. But really, Woodstock is just as good a place to draw the line, because it was the point where we all I say we all, I wasn't actually there, but we as a generation kind of recognized that there were a lot of us who all felt the same way and liked the same music and, and wanted out of Vietnam and wanted to smoke dope and stuff like that. And there was that great moment of recognition, and it was just kind of downhill from there because nothing really came of it.
And music, obviously, is a very major theme in this book.
Right.
How do you get music on the page? Everybody's got a different method. If you're actually listening to what you're writing about, or you're writing in silence, or you're listening to something else that's familiar to kind of tune out. What's your general MO when you're trying to get something on the page?
I think that, let me tilt that question just a little bit. I think that where a lot of people go wrong, as far as I'm concerned, with writing about music, is that there's this tendency to talk about your emotional response to it, and it ends up like reading a bad sex scene. There's the waves crashing on the shore and all this kind of stuff. Whereas the thing that works for me is to talk about music from the standpoint of a musician. So I have been in bands and I know a lot of musicians and stuff like that. So I feel like I'm comfortable with the way that musicians talk about music. And I think that's the key for me, is to write about music the way musicians talk about it, because they are the ones who have to talk about it.
It's funny, too. I'm not a musician myself. I've never been in a band, but I've hung around quite a few of them. And to be kind of behind the scenes and hearing the way they talk about a performance right afterwards, and how different that is from the way it was experienced on the other side of the stage. Right.
And when a musician listens to music, they're usually listening to different things than somebody who's driving around in a car listening to it on the radio who's not a musician. So they'll be more interested, they'll be more focused on the technical things. They'll say, wow, that was a nice Mixolydian mode, or something like that. And instead of just saying, well, kind of rocked, man. I could dance to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've got a passage here that talking about Bob Dylan, right?
Yes, and in fact, there's some music description in there.
So why don't we hear that?
I will read to you then. The main character of the book is a guy named Jeff Cole. Everybody just calls him by his last name for some reason. I don't know. It's 1965. Cole has just transferred from West Texas to a fancy private school in Dallas on scholarship. There he meets Alex, son of privilege, who is also 15 years old. Alex turns him on to Bob Dylan, who's about to make his second stop on his notorious electric tour, and that's where we pick up. Moody Coliseum was the SMU basketball court, a red brick box like all the campus buildings. They parked 2 blocks away in a student lot and joined the crowds on the wide flight of concrete steps outside. For all of Cole's father's talk about beatniks and long-haired weirdos, what they mostly saw was short-haired college boys in slacks and sport coats. A few balding guys in black turtlenecks, some women in their 30s with straight hair halfway down their backs and skirts above their knees, who looked like they'd taxied in from New York. Cole got his ticket out. He'd been carrying it in his billfold all week, and it had started to show some wear. They passed through the big glass doors and followed the signs to the steeply raked seats of Section M. The stage was below them and to their left, a set of risers with a white cloth backdrop and a rough scaffolding for the lights. He could make out instruments in the dimness of the stage, piano, organ, drums, amplifiers. He had trouble getting his breath. The wooden floor of the basketball court had been covered with a gray canvas tarp and folding chairs, nearly all of them full. The stream of people into the side sections had slowed to a trickle. Expectant silences passed over the crowd, followed by bursts of nervous talk. Cole saw that he was drumming his fingers on the wooden seat between his legs and forced himself to stop. At last the lights faded. A spotlight picked out the front of the stage and a disembodied voice introduced Columbia recording artist Bob Dylan. The applause was nearly drowned out by shouts and yelps and whistles. Then Dylan was there. Small, not more than 5'8", in his boots. Some kind of ultra-modern tan suit with no collar or lapels. Hair standing up like a rooster tail. Acoustic guitar, harmonica rack. He waited for the applause to fade. Then he leaned toward the mic and said, "Hi." Laughter, more applause. He stroked the guitar strings and the strokes turned into chords, and he started to sing. Of war and peace, the truth just twists. Until that moment, Cole had been detached, watching the movie unfold. Now, suddenly, the reality of it hit him in the solar plexus. He smelled the hair oil of the guy in front of him. He felt the density of the concrete beneath his loafers, heard the PA echo off the rear wall of the Coliseum, saw a kid in the front row of chairs lean forward to put his elbows on his knees. He felt the chill and dampness of the air that lay over the city, the curvature of the earth, the tidal pull of the moon. The piercing notes of the harmonica, Dylan's voice itself, nasal and whiny, his curiously emphatic "thee," his chilly distance, all meant more than the tangled symbolism of his lyrics. They were the secret handshake, the tap on the shoulder, the beckoning hand from the alleyway. They separated the curious from the initiated. Toward the end of the acoustic set, a girl with long, ironed blonde hair walked slowly out of the center aisle and floated towards the stage as if she'd been hypnotized. She reached out a hand to touch Dylan's boot, and before her fingers made contact, 2 cops materialized out of the shadows and gently led her away. Dylan finished the set with Desolation Row, a song that Cole was sure nobody else in the audience understood half as well as he did. None of the places he'd ever lived, not the mud brick houses and palm-lined suburbs of Suez, not the pastel-colored plaster walls and oily air of Villahermosa, not the blasted, salted plains of West Texas, and certainly not the high-rises and miniature mansions and paved-over scrublands of Dallas, had ever felt like home. The only space that the word defined for him was inside himself, a space that Dylan had mapped to the finest detail. The lights came up and Alex asked if he wanted anything. He was talking about getting a coat, Cole realized. He shook his head. The $4 he'd paid for his ticket had wiped out his allowance. His awareness kept returning to the stage. Tilted, overlapping circles of drum heads and cymbals, worn guitar necks propped against the silver fabric of the speaker cabinets, cables wrapped like vines around the trunks of microphone stands. Their hum ran up his spine. He was content to be in that fulcrum moment, knowing that once the electric set started, it would be on its way to being over. When Alex finally made it back, he had 2 Cokes and handed one to Cole. In case you changed your mind, the lines were really long. Thanks, man. He took a long drink. So what did you think? Cole opened his mouth and nothing came out. He thought of the blonde girl, drawn toward Dylan by currents of magnetic force. It was more like that than words. Yeah, Alex said, me too. The lights began to dim. The last voices in the audience fell silent at the same moment that the room went dark. Somebody moved on the stage. Shadows passed in front of the tiny red lights on the amplifiers. The bass drum gave out a single muffled thud. A voice counted to 4 and the stage lights came up behind a tidal wave of noise. So loud and so distorted, so garbled by echoes off the hard, flat walls, that Cole couldn't distinguish the individual instruments, let alone any semblance of melody or rhythm. Terrifying, exhilarating, uncontainable, triumphant. It blew harmlessly through Cole's body, even as it leveled Western civilization around him. Dylan had the same suit on, now under an electric guitar, and the electricity arced through his legs and made him jump stiffly across the stage. He charged the microphone and spat lyrics into it, his expression no longer distantly amused, but aggressive and defiant. He'd been booed, Cole had heard, in New York and L.A., and was clearly expecting it again. Cole felt the chord change more than heard it, and that and the lead guitar riff told him that the song was Tombstone Blues, the second cut on the first side of Highway 61. The chaos of sound clicked into focus, and now he could make out the words and hear the surging Lowry organ and the pummeling bass. Cole had grown up in the era of cowboy shows on television, and despite years without TV in Mexico and Egypt, he'd been obsessed with them. From Wanted Dead or Alive to Have Gun Will Travel to Cheyenne. The iconic pegged jeans, the low-slung holster and cartridge belt, hat and vest and boots added up to an image that overshadowed plot and dialogue and character. Dylan's new persona was equally powerful and fit precisely into the absence that the cowboys had left in Cole's imagination, the absence that the secret agents in their anonymous gray suits had never quite filled. Even more compelling was the lead guitarist at Dylan's left hand. Pinstripe jacket and tie, black hair, guitar as blonde as the girl from the audience, half smiling as he leaned into it, not so much creating the music as writing it the way a cowboy would, controlling it with flicks of the wrist, his body rippling with corollary motion. As the song clattered to a close, Cole heard whistles and cheers over the applause, and no boos at all. Cole clapped until his hands hurt. Dylan, more interested in his band than the audience, quickly started another song, Baby Let Me Follow You Down, the Animals rock version instead of the folk version from his first album, an album that hadn't moved Cole when Alex had played it for him. He was moved now. After that came It Ain't Me, Babe, and what had at first been noise was full of melody, not as cheap and accessible as the Italian love songs that Cole had once listened to on KRLD's Music Till Dawn, but all the more intense because of it. Then everything slowed and Dylan sang When You're Lost in the Rain in Juarez, and Cole snapped a mental picture to take with him for the rest of his life. Blue lights washing the stage, the giant shadow of the head of the bass guitar on the white backdrop, the drummer and the piano player both hunched over, Dylan, wide open to the microphone. The lead guitarist watching him, as everybody in the audience was watching him, leaning forward into the song as Cole was, and all of them together, surrendering. After that, Like a Rolling Stone, and then Maggie's Farm is encore with Dylan on piano. Not enough, really, but really, everything after that first electric onslaught had been overkill. The damage was done.
Nice.
Thank you.
So tell me, were you at that show?
I was at that show.
You were at that show. And
That was how it was.
that was how it was. So I'm guessing at age 15, right?
I was actually 14.
14. You weren't taking notes.
My protagonists are a year older than me.
Yeah. So, I mean, has that ever been released, that show?
Not that I know of. No.
Okay. How did you go back to reconstruct this?
I have to say, it's the memories are still very vivid. It
Wow.
was such a turning point in my life.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine once said that he'd read just the first few pages of the book, and he said that was like the last moment that music could actually change somebody's life. And it did change mine. That Christmas, I asked for a guitar for Christmas. I wanted to be a musician, and I was obsessed with rock and roll and the whole bit. It was a complete watershed for me.
Wow.
And so I remember at the time, I think, you know what this is like when you're writing. You'll create something, and then that becomes a memory in itself. Mm. But it seems to me that at the time I was taking mental photographs because I was so excited, and I was so into being there that I was just deliberately kind of soaking it in.
This is probably in your acknowledgments, and I just don't remember, but were there other accounts of it you could use to fact check it?
There were some newspaper clippings that had that mentioned the song order, and I actually had a couple of friends who were at the concert, and I checked with them. Mm-hmm. And they both remembered the girl with the blonde hair coming out and touching his shoe. And one of them actually remembered the audience booing, but he admitted that might have been, first of all, he was down on the main floor because he had a lot more money than we did. But he might have heard things that we didn't hear, but he also thinks his memories may have been influenced by listening over the years to other reports of how that tour turned out. Because later on the tour, he was booed, and there was the Judas moment in the UK that's very famous and stuff like that. But Levon Helm, in his autobiography, This Wheels on Fire, he talks about those concerts, and he said that Texas was the only place where they weren't booed. And he said Texas were the only people who really understood what Dylan was doing, which made me feel pretty good.
Interesting. Wow, yeah, there's so much mythology about that period, and so many things have been said about it. There are people who are adamant that yes, there were boos and that it overwhelmed everything else, and then there are others who are just as adamant that no, there really wasn't any booing to speak of. Yeah. So, yeah, pretty cool. What other sort of research did you turn to? Like the Woodstock part. You mentioned you weren't there, but right. You have your fictional band that's modeled kind of on one of the real life bands that was there.
Right. They played yesterday morning. I was.
You were listening?
Yeah, on that app. So that was cool. Well, the Woodstock stuff, I really I put a lot of work into that. One of the things, Orla and I went to the Woodstock site up in
Bethel, right?
Bethel, right. Or White Lake, also. It's arguable which township it's in. Anyway, so we went there. We went to the Woodstock Museum. My friend Bob Wayne was driving us around. He took us to the Holiday Inn, where what used to be the Holiday Inn, where they were staging the performers out of. I talked to people at the Holiday Inn into letting me into the lounge where that had been shut down and was used for storage. It's now like a Days Inn or something like that in Liberty. And they let me see the room where all the musicians were hanging out. And, people are generally pretty cooperative with you if you ask them nice. Mm-hmm. So I talked to John Sebastian, I don't know if you've ever talked to him, but
I haven't.
Great interview, hilarious guy, and just super nice. And so he gave me a lot of information. I read all the standard books, and then I read the non-standard books. There's a small press publication by a woman who interviewed a bunch of the people who were in the audience. She got like 50 different people who were in the audience, or had meant to go to the festival and didn't make it, and stuff like that. And those were really good and really useful. Of course, at that time there was a PBS special that was called Woodstock Diary that took stuff in order. There's an incredible site called the Woodstock Wiki. It's an entire wiki devoted to Woodstock, has timelines, photographs, eyewitness accounts, stuff like that. What else? I just immersed myself. I interviewed some friends who had been there, just everything I could find.
So you were in bands back then and part of the whole thing. Were there times writing this where you thought of it as memoir or biography at all?
No, I think the demands of memoir and autobiography are so. I mean, you're supposed to tell the truth.
Yeah.
And I never wanted to have to bend my narrative to fit my life, which I think is kind of boring, actually. So I wanted to go where the story was taking me. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, there were times when the research forced me to change directions a couple of times. Mm-hmm. But I didn't have the urge to. I like to the stuff that's really autobiographical. I like to kind of put in code. Mm-hmm. So Cole has an accident on an oil field drilling rig. I had an accident with a power saw. It's his right hand, my left hand. So there's a lot of correspondence in there, but it's kind of hidden in disguise.
Yeah, as someone who worked in oil fields summers from college, I kind of shuddered at that part.
Oh, I bet you did. Yeah. One of the other Woodstock things, I forgot to mention this, the internet, of course, is an incredible source for research if you fact check scrupulously.
Right.
But I got in touch with some guys who were Woodstock fanatics, and they have been quietly and illegally putting together the best complete concert recording that they could, and I managed to get hold of a copy of that. Of course, that's now all completely out the window because they've officially now released the complete stuff.
Right.
But at the time, that was the best you could get, and so that was hugely helpful. There were a bunch of stage announcements on there that you hadn't heard before, and a bunch of Keith Hartley band that no one had ever heard of, their Woodstock footage and stuff. So that was very cool. Again, it was, sometimes it's just a question of putting yourself out there, finding the right people. There'll be like message boards or groups or Facebook groups or stuff like that you can get in touch with. There's I forget which thing it's on. Yahoo group for Tim Hardin. Mm-hmm. And I just through Googling found out that Susan Hardin, who's Tim's widow, was occasionally on that group because a few of her messages popped up. So I just got on the group and said, I want to talk to you. And she wrote me an email back and said, what the hell is so important that you need to talk to me? And I wrote back the best email of my life. And I managed to get her to, fortunately she's a reader, and I sent her Say Goodbye, which has a lot of references to Tim Hardin in it. Mm-hmm. And she liked the way I talked about Tim, so she started to help me. And she introduced me to Eric Jacobson, who was Tim Hardin's producer, Weapon Spoonful producer. And I got to great interview with Eric. Richie Unterberger, I should mention.
Yeah.
He's a rock journalist, and he has a bunch of stuff online. He had some interviews with people that I was using in the book. So I contacted Richie and said, I'd love to see the raw transcripts of this. Mm-hmm. And he ended up taking me and Orla on a walking tour of Golden Gate Park and the neighborhood and where everybody lived and stuff like that. And that was really super cool.
So this is how many novels for you now?
This is number 8.
Number 8, wow. And how, what is your elevator speech when people come to you and say, how do you get a novel published? What do you tell people?
I tell them I'm the last person to ask. I can barely get a novel published myself.
The fact that you can, though.
Well, the fact that I can is really due to the fact that the guy who publishes Subterranean Books is a huge fan of mine. Mm-hmm. And he's loved my work from the get-go pretty much. And because of that, he's willing to publish me even if he doesn't make any money off of it. So that's kind of the bottom line. I can't tell people how to get published.
Yeah.
And I have an agent now for the first time in 20 years.
Oh, wow. Because
my friend Joe Lansdale, the guy who's engineered my Italy translation, Joe talked him into looking at the book and convinced him to market it in England. But I've been basically without an agent or a publisher other than Subterranean for 20 years.
So of the previous 7 books, which is your favorite? And I realize this is like asking what's your favorite kid.
Yeah, it is pretty much. It varies from day to day. My second novel, Deserted Cities of the Heart, has a fair amount of rock and roll in it. It's got a character, actually. No one has noticed this yet, but there's a guy named Eddie Yates in Deserted Cities of the Heart who shows up outside the Gates of Eden at the Battle of the Bands.
No kidding.
That's the Eddie Yates who's at the Battle of the Bands in high school, and outside the Gates of Eden is the same guy who was in Deserted Cities of the Heart. So, the thing about Deserted Cities, several years ago, I got to, again, because of the publisher at Subterranean, a guy named Bill Schaefer, I got the opportunity to basically bring all my books out as print on demand. Mm-hmm. And so that meant I did all the typesetting myself, and I did the covers and everything so that Bill wouldn't have any expenses really involved in it. And so in the process of digitizing my earlier books, I got to reread Deserted Cities, and I was impressed at the research, frankly. This book was written pre-internet, and how I knew all that stuff still impresses me. So today I'll say it's Deserted Cities is my favorite of their other books.
I'm still partial to Glimpses myself.
Well, thank you. I had some issues with Glimpses. I'm not crazy about the narrator in the narrative structure, but hey, what do I know?
You're not crazy about the narrator, what, on a...
He's such a wimp. He's always whining and carrying on.
Well, Cole kind of whines a little bit too here.
Yeah, well, I suppose.
Do you feel like you have to like your characters?
I think that's a really good question. Yeah, I think you have to some extent, at least be able to see through your character's eyes. I have never subscribed to the kind of storytelling where you have a villain who's just bad. He kicks puppies, he sets fire to people's laundry. I just that's not interesting to me. So I prefer to actually not have any per se villains, but just have characters who are at cross purposes, who are both intend well, but because they're the way they were brought up or whatever, or the things that they want, they end up at cross purposes. But no one's really a bad guy. So, and for a really long book, if I'm in somebody's point of view, my novel Black and White, I have a long section from a character who I don't like, but for the most part, yeah, I think that it is important that I have some kind of respect or understanding or even love for the character.
Do you have, when it comes to coming up with characters, have any sort of writing exercises?
Yeah, I have on occasion. There's the sort of two poles with characters. One is when they're completely invented, and the other is where you just absolutely, you take someone you know in real life and you put them into your book. The character of Madeline here is based on a friend of mine. And I'd call her up and ask her questions, or email her and say, what was it like when you had your first kid? And just steal whatever she told me. At the other extreme, there are characters that are just completely invented. There are characters that are based on historical figures, all of that stuff. But every once in a while, you'll still get stuck. You'll feel like you're losing your focus. You're not visualizing this person clearly. And what I do, I have a notebook that I have for each of the books that I write. And I'll get to a blank page in the notebook and I'll say, I am so-and-so, and write the character's name. And I'll just start free associating. And finding stuff that feels right or doesn't feel right. If it doesn't feel right, I don't write it down. But if I get, I find that sort of taps into my subconscious and taps into a subconscious understanding of the character that I may not even have been able to verbalize before. But that little exercise is really good for me in getting focused on the character again. Then I can see them and I can visualize them acting out in the book and stuff.
Yeah, on the advice of a very wise editor once, the best character writing exercise that I've ever found was, she said, do, after the first draft, character sketches where you ask each one a question. And I sat down when the first draft of the novel I wrote, and I asked everybody the question, what time do you get up in the morning? And it was like flipping a switch. Stuff just poured out because I had this first draft, but I wasn't happy with the characters. And it was like given a chance to speak. Each one kind of told me who they were. Yeah. So, that's
actually very similar process because it's what you just said. It's giving them a chance to speak.
Yeah.
And I can get in a frame of mind where I don't want to write something that I'm not going to use directly in the book. Yeah. But then sometimes you have to do that. Yeah. You have to do that, exactly what you're talking about. Let them speak. Let them get stuff off their chest so that you can get familiar with it.
So you talked about, the characters in this, some being based on real people and some being completely made up. Someone based on the folk singer Melanie is a very key part of this. Did you reach out to her at all?
No, I didn't. I don't know how closely I guess she is kind of like Melanie, isn't she? I put her into Melanie's slot in Woodstock. But I'd never really consciously said, okay, I'm basing her on Melanie. The way, for instance, Skip Shaw, who's in my novel Say Goodbye, and is also in here, he's sort of consciously based on Tim Harden. But
who is also in it.
Yes, who's also in it. But I didn't consciously base her on Melanie, so I didn't try to get in touch with Melanie. Probably should have. I like her. She's cool.
She would have been cool to talk to.
Yeah, I bet.
You mentioned Skip Shaw and Eddie Yates as like recurrent characters. Do you have Easter eggs like that over the span of books that you'll drop in?
Yeah, once in a while. There's a moment in Say Goodbye when the band is on tour and they listen to Eddie Yates' solo album. And it's just kind of tossed in gently, and it's an Easter egg. There's not a lot of them. It was only when I sat down and started writing this that I realized I had the opportunity to work in these other characters. And so then I started, sort of going back in reverse and knitting some of the plot threads together. It was never my intention to be a Balzac and have this universe where all the characters are always interacting with each other. And it's just something that happened with this book. And I ended up not taking it too far. At one point, I was going to try and work in every character from at least one character from every book. And then I just, it's going to hurt the book if I try to do that.
Have you thought about this in movie terms at all? This could be a gigantic, sprawling epic that would be very complicated to make.
Yeah, I'd love to. It would need to be a TV series.
Yeah,
You
you're probably
couldn't
right. I don't think you could
cram
do it in
into
2
a-
hours.
No. So it would need to be like a 10-hour, 20-hour TV epic. George Martin, obviously from the blurb on the cover, is a fan of the book, and he's tried to get some people interested, but so far no luck. My agent is also trying to get somebody going on it.
So that's a pretty gold-plated endorsement to get from George Martin.
Yeah.
How did that come to pass?
George and I are old friends.
Oh, okay.
When I lived in Austin in the early 80s, George had a couple of friends down there, Howard Walgrove, Lisa Tuttle.
Mm-hmm.
And he would come down there to visit, and he used to have to sleep on Waldrop's floor. And then he got introduced to me. At that time, I was married with a guest room with a door that closed on it and a comfortable double bed in it and a well-stocked refrigerator. George immediately decided that he would be better off staying at my place than at Howard's. And we got to be friends, and he's never forgotten that. So he brought me in when he started doing the Wild Cards series, which is a shared world, comic book based series of anthologies. George had me as one of the initial writers on that. So he's always liked my work. He's been very supportive. Super nice guy.
Great.
And very blue collar, union man. And all his millions have not changed him. So bless George Martin.
Nice when that happens.
He's a good guy.
Do y'all have any questions? We could carry on here, but we'd like this to be kind of dialogue-ish. If anybody's
You want to know what time I get up in the morning?
I was struck when Liz said that you're supposed to tell the truth. There's someone else who's delving back into the 1960s as well, Quentin Tarantino, and Once Upon a Time.
I have not seen that.
You have,
Sorry.
have not seen it.
No, I've
But
been
the
hearing
idea-
about it. I've been hearing
But
this.
he'll show up with his flamethrower and sort of set everything right if something happened. But he has a very negative view of hippies, that it's about the Manson murder.
Mm-hmm.
And if you try and understand what the hippie was 50 years ago and watch this film, it's a very negative view.
Well, let me just throw this out because it's something that probably needs to be said as often as possible. A lot of us who were in the counterculture back in the 60s never thought of ourselves as hippies. We thought hippies were figures of fun. They were these people with the headbands and the shoulder-length hair and the sandals and stuff. And we just thought they were silly. And we were all in our blue jeans and T-shirts, and we thought of ourselves as freaks. An important distinction between freaks and hippies. Freaks are cool. Hippies, they're just conformists.
Hippies are like posers,
Yeah,
kind of.
yeah. A lot of them were.
Yeah.
So let me just say that making fun of hippies is not unique to Tarantino. There's some fun making of hippies in my novel.
Yeah. Indeed. Who else? Steve.
I got so many things I could ask.
Well, ask them all. We got time.
First of all, I when I saw the thickness of the book, I thought, of course, it's a long song, so it's a big book. But in glimpses, and David was talking about how you're able to put music on the page. Were you able to hear, for example, the version of Long and Winding Road that was created? Could you hear that?
In my head, you
Yeah,
mean?
you know how it's
I don't feel that I got as close to it as I should have. I tried, but it felt more like I was trying to push this thing to where I could hear it rather than my getting it revealed to me. I was, they had the Let It Be Naked bootleg, and I was kind of surprised when I heard that. It wasn't exactly what I thought it would be. And when Brian finally came out with Smile, I was really surprised. That was very different from what I expected.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, I had pictured Smile as being very emotional the way Pet Sounds was. And in fact, it's kind of scientific in a way.
There's a coldness to it.
Yeah.
That's surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally didn't expect that. And yet, it seems like he did correctly bring forth the album that he had always meant to have. And I think that was always a part of it that I had just not picked up on.
I guess I have a two-parter that goes to each of you. I'm wondering what the topic was of your thesis and then how it played into the book.
Well, have you ever heard of the Armadillo World headquarters in Austin, Texas?
No.
This was a beer garden concert hall, converted National Guard Armory, and it's basically where progressive country music was invented in the 1970s. Willie and Waylon and the boys playing for crowds of pot-smoking hippies. And it's funny, it became this like media image of Austin. Every time Newsweek or the New York Times or Wall Street Journal would come to town, do a story about Austin is the hot new place, they'd open with a scene at the Armadillo like that. And this created an image that kind of doomed it. You know, of course, it went through this incredible growth that continues to this day, and quaint institutions like that could not compete economically with it. So years after the Armadillo was torn down, it was still in all the Chamber of Commerce brochures, which used to drive me nuts. So, I wrote my journalism master's thesis about this. It was not a popular choice in the department. I had to get the department freak to be my advisor. They wanted something a little more clinical than that. And it was background for Austin.
And the thesis was so much more than that, though, because David talked about the University of Texas, Frank Irwin, who was the chancellor there, who was a fascist pig.
Yes, he was.
about progressive country music, how that fit in with the zeitgeist of the period. It should be published as a book. It's really, really a good piece of work. And I got all kinds of stuff out of it. So it was mostly, I had someone who was a student at UT, University of Texas, in like 1970, I guess, was the Kent State riots and stuff like that. And so I was, and then my main character Cole comes back to Austin in the late, I guess like mid 70s. So he goes to the Armadillo and plays the Armadillo. David's thesis was just endlessly useful.
Anyone else out there?
Yes.
You mentioned that you've had some moments where research had changed the plot that you started on. Can you describe how some of those moments might have come across and how you ended up dealing with that particular?
Yeah, let me see if I can. I knew if I said that, someone was going to ask that question. I'm stumped at the moment to think of an example of it, but I will cogitate on it and see if I can come up with something. Basically, it would be, well, there would be questions of timing. Like I would think that an album was out in such and such year, and it actually didn't come out until the year after, or something like that. And so that could be a plot point that needed to be fixed. I remember looking desperately for an 8-track recording machine in San Francisco in 1970, whatever it was, 73 or something. There just wasn't one. And so it was pretty much a constant challenge. I was always going back and forth. One of the things that was interesting was just seeing the amount of misinformation that's on the internet. And it gets picked up. It happened to me with this book. My English publisher, for some reason, decided I published 9 novels. Now, everywhere, when there's a review of the book, Schreiner's 9th novel. And it's like, no, there's 8. And I saw this particularly got me. There's a guy named Mitch Miller, who was the A&R guy for the head producer type guy for Columbia Records in the 50s and 60s. And he used to have a TV show called Sing Along with Mitch. It was hugely popular.
Follow the Bouncing Ball.
And all these albums and stuff. And in his obituary, in every single obituary that I saw, they talked about how in Sing Along with Mitch, they had Follow the Bouncing Ball for the lyrics. No, you couldn't do a bouncing ball on live TV with the technology of the time. In fact, they just had the lyrics printed out at the bottom of the screen. But everybody remembered that bouncing ball.
I've heard that for years, so it's not really...
Right.
Wow.
And people remembered the bouncing ball, from animated cartoons, where you can do it because you control the timing and everything. But Sing Along with Mitch, no. And you can prove it because there's Sing Along with Mitch episodes that are on YouTube now, and you can look them up. And there's the just all caps stuff at the bottom of the screen. But it got picked up one place and just got broadcast everywhere.
As a music industry geek of long standing, I was particularly fascinated with the Roy Hulley character.
Oh yeah.
He was somebody who worked with just everybody over the years. Paul Simon and
well, he started out with 11 Spoonful.
With 11 Spoonful, yeah.
And he engineered a lot of the sound effects. That Summer in the City by the 11 Spoonful has got this big bang at the beginning of it, and the drums have got this incredible echo. And this is all Roy Hulley's work. Mm-hmm. He went on to do Simon and Garfunkel and a ton of other big acts. Yeah, interesting character. So I stole some of his resume and slipped it into one of my characters' resumes. And that's another reason why I feel like I have to have acknowledgments, because I don't want to piss Roy Hulley off. The guy's brilliant. Mm-hmm. And I want him to know that I knowingly stole his stuff. It wasn't a mistake.
And I think he's about maybe the most likable character in the book.
Dave, the producer?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you.
Did you ever communicate with him? Have you heard anything from him?
From Hulley?
Yeah.
No. I did communicate with Eric Jacobson, as I said, and since Eric is a character in there, and Dave is somewhat based on Eric also. Mm-hmm. So I did not try to get hold of Roy.
Okay. What else y'all got?
Was the commune something that might have shifted your direction? I don't know the answer to this.
No, I don't think so. That was kind of, I kind of knew when that was going to happen from the start. So,
you said this book took 10 years.
8, but it's been a couple of years since I finished it.
Right. So, what's a typical workday for you look like when you're working on something like this?
Well, at the time, a typical workday involved my going to IBM for 8 hours.
One of those.
And then coming home and trying to keep my eyes open while I typed on the book. For most of the book, I was working a 30-hour week. There was part of the book where I was down to 20, and there was part of the book where I was working 40. But I was continuously employed through the entirety of those 8 years. And so that had a lot to do with it. So what that meant was I had to want it real bad. Mm-hmm. So when I wasn't working or sleeping, I was pretty much doing the book. Well, I can testify to that. I'd come crawling home. I'd do my daily exercises. I enjoy running every day. And I'd come back from running, shower, eat dinner, go to the office and work. Get up Saturday morning, start typing. And when we talk about 880 pages, I have some very old-fashioned writing techniques, which is I type the entire thing, I print the entire thing, and I wipe out the files and I start again and retype every page. Because that's the only way that I can detach enough that I don't get caught up in the story as I'm revising it.
But you're not just retyping.
Yeah, I'm not just retyping. I'm rewriting as I go, but it's not rewriting in place and editing an existing manuscript. I'm actually retyping it.
So this is 200,000 or 300,000 words.
350.
350,000 words. Wow. And how many drafts did you go through?
It depends on how you define draft, but in terms of retyping it, I only retyped the entire thing once. But after the initial draft, I did a lot of revising in place. Yeah. Then I retyped it. Then I did a lot more revising in place. Then I read the entire novel backwards for typos and repeated words and stuff. I did searches.
I've heard about that. Interesting.
Yeah, that's an old proofreading technique. Because reading it backwards, again, you can detach from the sense of the sentence and look at the words individually.
Whoa.
I have words that I overuse that I have in a list, and I go through and search. Now when we're talking the manuscript, we're talking about almost 1,300 pages of manuscript. searching 1,300 pages of manuscript for common words like I use too many gerunds, so I looked up ing space. 1,300 pages.
So was this MS Word or Google Doc? Or
MS Word.
MS Word. Wow.
Yeah.
And is the whole thing in one take? MS Word?
When I was originally writing it, I had it in 3 sections, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But by the end, yeah, I dumped it all in one.
Now, did you ever give some thought to, 2 volumes, say? Or did you just wanted it all in one big thing?
I was insistent that it be one book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ego, because I was just terrified that if it was published as 2 volumes, people would buy the first volume and not the second. Mm-hmm. And my ego couldn't take that. I would just be heartbroken. So I wanted to force them to buy the whole thing at once.
Well, it's well worth ponying up for, everybody. So, any more questions? Steve, I bet you got some.
I'm sorry. What is the title called?
Title comes from Bob Dylan. He has a song called Gates of Eden. And it's because most of the song is talking about what goes on inside the Gates of Eden. But the last verse is outside the Gates of Eden. There is no truth outside the Gates of Eden. But being me, I also had another little Easter egg. There is the commune that Orla was talking about in there is called Eden Farm. And there is a point at which my protagonist is literally standing outside the Gates of Eden. So it had some resonance.
And none of them exactly get what they want.
No.
I mean, everybody is kind of literally outside the Gates of Eden.
Yeah.
In that way. But some of them get what they need. As Mick Jagger.
Somebody said that.
Steve, did you have another question?
Well, I can come up with something, sure. What I find really interesting is that you reacted at the age of 14 to the electric Dylan. Wasn't familiar with him at the time it was happening. I was totally into the Beatles. Mm-hmm. But it always seemed to me that people were really taken with the like the acoustic versions that he would do. And when he gets on stage with the band, that's what pissed him off. It was so different.
The records that he did right before he started that tour, Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61, both of them had a mix of acoustic and electric stuff on there. And I love the acoustic stuff. I love the electric stuff. The electric stuff, just like Tom Thumb's Blues and Lost in the Rain. That stuff just really grabbed me. And so when he played it electric on stage, I was ready. I wanted it. And I was more of a Stones guy than a Beatles guy, and that maybe made a difference in what I was open to, what I reacted to. I didn't come to appreciate the Beatles really until probably the 80s. I mean, I liked them okay, but I was a big Stones fan. I liked the raw, bluesier sort of stuff.
I actually have a very good friend who knew them. She's from Liverpool. Knew them. Mm-hmm. Her guy's Dylan. She loves Dylan. Yeah. And she was at the Manchester show and was very happy about it because she had tickets way in the back. Mm-hmm. And when people left, she was able to
moved up.
So.
Cool.
So she heard the famous interaction.
I don't know if she heard Judas, but yeah, she was there. She saw him several times.
Yeah. That is a fascinating record to listen to, by the way. The Royal Albert Hall, mislabeled for years, but yeah, I've never heard anything quite like that. The crowd sounds on it, it's really quite something.
Yeah, that was another thing that I used to help me remember. I had actually bought that when it was just a bootleg, and I bought it as a cassette in New York City.
All right.
And got back then when we could all play cassettes. Uh-huh. And so I listened to that quite a bit.
So what does one do for an encore after an 880-page?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm daunted by it, I will admit. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. if I do anything, it will be something completely different. It will be short. It will be probably highly literary and probably not have any music in it.
Right. Got it out of your system, I guess.
All right, well, we'll
Purged.
see. We'll see.
Cool. Any other questions, y'all? Well, thank you so much for coming.
Yes,
this
thank
has
you
been
indeed.
this has been fun. Look for this at your retailer of choice.
Yeah, let me just say, we're not selling books here. I've got a few postcards here with information about the book on it. If you want to pick one of those up while they last, there's not many of them. I've got some bookmarks here with my backlist on it. The local library is carrying, some of the branches have copies of the book, so you can reserve it through the whole program at the library and get it that way, or you can buy it off Subterranean Press site, or you can go to Amazon.com.
Very good.
I hope you will check me out.
Thank you, Louis.
Thank you, David. Good night.
Thank you both so much for joining us. We
Oh,
really
thank you
enjoyed
for having
having you.
us.
It was fascinating.
Pleasure.
For everyone who is attending, we just wanted to highlight for you before you go that next month, our September workshop is actually a local author showcase. Several authors, I think we have 11 signed up so far, who participate in National Novel Writing Month, have agreed to come and mingle and do readings and talks and meet with readers. So if you're interested in meeting local authors, we hope you will join us for that next time. And thank you all for coming and joining us.
Thank you all so much.